Hello, top of the morning, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: Russian military repels missile attack on Crimea's Sevastopol. Russian Black Sea Fleet commander killed, no comment by Moscow. Plus, long-awaited U.S.-made Abrams tanks arrive in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. Russian forces have repelled an attack on the Crimean port of Sevastopol, downing one missile. Russian of Sevastopol, Razvozhayev, cited preliminary data on Telegram, explaining that the interception took place near the Belbek military airfield. An air raid alert was subsequently lifted and traffic has resumed on the main bridge linking the Russian mainland with the Crimean peninsula. The commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, Admiral Viktor Sokolov, has been reported dead after a Ukrainian attack last week on the fleet headquarters in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. The Russian Defense Ministry has neither confirmed nor denied this information put out by Ukraine's special forces. Now, according to the Ukrainian military, Friday's attack was targeted at a meeting of the Russian Navy's leadership in the city of Sevastopol. It was not immediately clear how Ukraine's special forces counted the dead and wounded in that attack. Russian installed officials confirmed the Ukrainian attack on Friday, saying that at least one missile struck the fleet headquarters. Kyiv has stepped up attacks on the Black Sea and Crimea as Ukrainian forces press on with an almost 4-month-old counteroffensive to take back Russian-occupied territory. Russian combat drones and cruise missiles destroyed buildings and infrastructure at the Black Sea port of Odessa, including grain storage facilities. The attacks were part of an air campaign that has made it harder for Ukraine to export its products since Moscow quit a deal in mid-July that had enabled Black Sea shipment. The strikes have intensified as Kyiv presses on with the counteroffensive in the south and the east that has made slow gains. Odessa region governor Ole Kipper says the facilities that were hit had almost contained 1,000 tons of grain and that the bodies of 2 men were found under the rubble of a warehouse where grain was stored. Ukraine's military claims to have shot down 19 Iranian-made Shahed drones and 11 cruise missiles overnight, most of which were directed at the Odessa region. And in encouraging news for Ukraine, U.S.-made Abrams tanks have arrived in the country. U.S. President Joe Biden had promised in the previous week that the first American tanks will be delivered to Ukraine this week. The U.S. has sent approximately $113 billion worth of security and humanitarian aid to help President Zelensky's government since Russia invaded in February 2022. The death toll of the Russian strikes on southern Kherson and Ukraine on Monday has risen to at least 6, and 5 others are injured. In an earlier social media post, head of the region military administration, Alexander Prokudin, had reported 3 people dead and 2 others injured as a result of the Russian airstrike in the city of Berislav in the Kherson region on Monday. Prokudin laments that only a quarter of the population remains in Berislav after civilian evacuations following intense Russian shelling. The Speaker of Canada's House of Commons has apologized to the chamber for praising an individual who served in a Nazi unit during World War II. Speaker Anthony Rota on Friday had recognized 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka as a Ukrainian hero before the Canadian Parliament. Hunka, who was seated in the gallery, served in World War II as a member of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, according to Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, a Jewish human rights group that demanded the apology. Mr. Rota took responsibility for what was characterized as an oversight, calling the initiative entirely his own. The recognition came following a visit by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who thanked Canada for its assistance in his country's war against Russia.
I would say that as parliamentarians, we place our trust in you. There are many times when we recognize people in the gallery, and we do so on your good advice and your good offices. And all of us here did that in the chamber on Friday because we trusted you on that. I think this unfortunate situation has been deeply embarrassing for Canada's Parliament. I think it's been deeply embarrassing for Canada, and I think it was deeply embarrassing for the President of the Ukraine, who came here in friendship, who came here because we are a strong ally, and who came here because he trusted Canadians.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very grave incident on a day when the government of Canada is welcoming the head of state of Ukraine, a country that is undergoing an unjust and illegal invasion. There was a guest in the gallery whose presence fed into the Russian propaganda and narrative about the bogus justification for Putin's illegal invasion.
I want to apologize for what happened and really tell you that the intention was not to embarrass this House. My sincere apologies to the House, to each and every one of you who are in the House today, and to all Canadians for having been put through this.
What happened Friday was horrible. It was terrible. It was profoundly hurtful for so many Canadians and to people around the world. And he has to step down as a consequence of that.
What responsibility should the government bear?
Well, we're focused, the Speaker said it was his decision. I believe him on that. It is a decision that comes fraught with profound consequences. One of those consequences, as far as we are concerned, is that he needs to step aside as Speaker.
We now speak with President Emeritus, Corporate Council on Africa, former president of the American Center on International Leadership, and currently he is a partner, Gainful Solutions, Mr. Stephen Hayes, who is speaking to us virtually from Washington, D.C. in the United States. Very good morning to you. How are things in Washington?
Well, it's crazy as usual. It's people at each other's throats. There's no forward progress, but that's Washington, unfortunately, for the last year or so, if not longer.
I can imagine. We'll get to the politics of that comments you've made, but let's start with one of your neighbors, Canada, another North American country, where the House of Commons Speaker, I believe, Anthony Rota, shot himself in the foot by recognizing a Nazi war criminal. Do you think he's apologizing because it's generated a very massive negative reaction, or he genuinely didn't know the import of what he was doing by recognizing such an individual on such a platform?
I think it reflected a great deal of lack of historical knowledge. It was stupid. I think he certainly apologized because I think he made a very dumb mistake. I think if he had known about the history of that, of not only the man, but the history of Ukraine, it would have been a very different situation. But he clearly didn't know the history of Ukraine either. The thing is that in World War II, a great number of Ukrainians did fight for the German side out of historical perspective. Partly because of the Russian oppression of Ukraine during the 1920s, where 5 million Ukrainians died through largely forced starvation. So there was a strong anti-Russian feeling in Ukraine, and perhaps they did see it as a way of independence. I think it was a poor choice to fight for Germany, of course. And also there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, which is part of the reason that the firestorm in Canada right now. Atrocities like Baba Yar would never have happened if it had not been for a strong Ukrainian collaboration. So this did feed right into the Russian propaganda on the current Ukraine war. It was just amazingly stupid. He was clearly supporting a constituent, appealing for votes in a way from his own area, and just showed a total lack of knowledge of history.
Really, it's amazing. Didn't he know that that was a former SS guy?
Well, I don't know that he did know that. I would be interested to see if he really did. I think he said I think he believed what he said, and what he said was stupid, because he said that it was a Ukrainian freedom fighter fighting against Soviet oppression. It wasn't at all in that case in the 1940s. The Soviets were, if anything, freeing Ukraine. And Ukraine then was a part of the Soviet Union, so it wasn't. He wasn't a freedom fighter in any sense, or fighting the Soviets. He was fighting the Allies, for that matter.
Thank you for that historical perspective. And Canada has not been shy of controversy recently, them being principal allies of Ukraine. India as well, being in the mix, but not so much of an ally as Canada, who, in the case of the killing of the Sikh leader in Canada, have stirred up a bit of a diplomatic row with India.
Well, having spent a lot of time in Canada and just recently sold our house in Canada after 20-some years of being able to go up there, quite familiar with the situation. I think there's a very strong Indian population in Canada. I would say roughly between 8 to 10% of the population is probably Indian derivation. So it is a big issue. And as far as India goes, in terms of the Ukraine war, I think that they're fairly neutral. I think they've gone both ways on this, but that has little to do with what happened in Canada. If it is true, it's an outrage from any perspective. It's not totally surprising these days. Almost any country, something like that happens, but I think that the situation between Canada and India will necessarily cool. It must cool, because that's also an important, if not ally, an important friend to Canada, which is a strong economic point too from India.
Indeed, if they're reducing their diplomatic staff, that is the Canadian diplomatic staff in Canada, then it better get better before it gets worse. But lest we digress, since these are two principal allies of Ukraine, the Ukraine war as it stands. Ukraine is seriously, continually targeting Crimea. And now, if it is confirmed that this senior Russian naval commander has been killed, the retaliation can be expected to be a matter of course.
I think retaliation has already started. I think they hit Odessa again as well, and it will continue. How badly does it hurt Russia? Temporarily, probably, because they do have a chain of command. So it's as we say in sports, it's the next man up, and so I think that it may damage morale some. It does show that. Russia is not impermeable to attack and serious hits, but in the long term, I don't think it's going to change too much in terms of the chain of command and the situation.
Speaking of the situation, the state of the counteroffensive as it stands, what is your estimation?
Well, it's always been the same, that I think by the end of this next month, we'll have a much better idea. But clearly there isn't a major breakthrough. I've always said that I think it was unrealistic to expect a major breakthrough. When you announce you're going to do a counter-offensive and then give the opponent a whole year to build defenses, it's not going to be a very fast attack or counterattack, depending on your point of view. So I think that we're probably going to get a very slow, perhaps some progress on the Ukraine side, but it's difficult right now to see an end to this. That is an end at which either side declares itself victorious. I think at some point we're going to have negotiations. Unfortunately, neither side really wants that for very different reasons. One is national pride, identity on the Ukraine side, and the Russian attitude towards Ukraine now is going to make it very difficult for Putin to say let's have discussions or let's have negotiations.
Indeed. The supply of the Abrams tanks now to Ukraine by the United States obviously is adding fuel to the fire, but is it going to make a dent in the operations? Because we heard of the supply of the munitions, the cluster munitions, and when that began to happen, there was no significant impact as far as the war in its entirety is concerned, because we nary have we heard of whether this happened or that happened because of the cluster munitions. And the drones, the long-range missiles supplied from the UK and from France, and then the tanks supplied from Germany. So is this just going to add to what they already have, or you think it'll make a difference in the attack?
I think it will make an incremental difference. I don't think it's going to make a significant difference. I think it'll help in some counteroffensive and penetrations, but it's not going to be the overwhelming, the new piece of equipment that makes the war totally winnable for Ukraine. I think it's going to probably drag the war on, frankly, because it's going to be, the Abrams tank is deemed fairly effective. I think it's going to be interesting to see how well it does do against Russian anti-tank material, but we'll see. I just don't, my own opinion is that I don't see a strong breakthrough simply because of the tanks. But will they help? Certainly they'll help. How much, I think, remains to be seen, and how well the Russians defend against that will determine.
Well, the allies of Ukraine certainly, I'm sure, will be commending the Ukrainian soldiers, because they have to go through a lot of training with all of these weapons that they're getting, for the ones that they don't have enough training for the ones that they're anticipating supply, such as the F-16s. The technology in that regard, for instance, the F-35 that we hear was lost by pilots in the United States. Is there any developments on that? Because it's the same sort of technology that will be used for the F-16s, albeit maybe a higher one. But they lost the F-35.
I'm not a technological expert. In fact, sometimes I say I'm at the bottom 10% of new technology. But in any case, I think first of all, you pointed out on the Ukraine soldiers, I think it's one thing about this war that I think has been inspiring is the courage of the Ukraine soldiers. Now, in terms of training, it does take some time. We would hope that there has been some already trained on Abrams tanks before they were delivered. It's a lot easier to train from afar than it is in the middle of the battle. So I'm going to assume that there are some Ukrainians who have already been trained on it. The same way with the aircraft. It's going to take some time, as usual, but I think again, it's probably by the end of October we should see some result of the training as well. But again, I just don't see great advances, and I think it was wrong to put hopes for quick advances on a counteroffensive. It's made some progress, I'd say incremental progress, and whether new weapons make a difference remains to be seen.
Interesting times, politically speaking, in the United States, wouldn't you say, Mr. Hayes, with the support for Ukraine by President Joe Biden's administration. What can you tell us about this government shutdown and how it's impacted by supply of aid to Ukraine? Is that a major issue that is going on with the peace?
Ukraine has become more of an issue than I anticipated, say, 6 months ago. Because, again, most of the population of the United States is very much in support of Ukraine. However, what the latest polls show is that about 50% of the, actually a little more than 50% of the country does not want U.S. troops in Ukraine, and I don't think there's any immediate danger of that in any case. And the majority continues to support. But 28% of the country now feels that we've given too much aid to Ukraine, not too much in terms of what they need, but too much in regard to what's needed in spending, domestic spending. So that's going to become an issue, and the Republicans are going to play on that hard. There isn't yet a shutdown. There is a lot going on behind the scenes, so I'm hopeful that there will not be a shutdown. I think the Republican Party overall doesn't want one because it's clearly going to be blamed for that. So it doesn't necessarily help the Republicans. But the central issue seems to be from the 20, particularly the 20 dissenters, is the support for Ukraine. They do not want, the issue is that they do not want Ukraine aid in the bill that needs to be passed for continuing governance. So that's got to be worked out in some way, and there are some congressional and procedural machinations behind the scenes that are being discussed. But what it does require is that the Speaker of the House, Republican of course, works with the Democrats to some extent. And so that's going to be very, very difficult for the House Speaker to do, to move forward as he claims he wants to. He has to, and without the Democrats, he has to have those 20 that have been consistently a thorn in his side, and I might say a thorn in America's side in many ways too.
Speaking of Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker, if he doesn't cut a deal with the Democrats, is the speakership in jeopardy? Will he be removed by the Republicans?
Yeah, he would be in jeopardy. I think you can't deny that. The group of 20 or more would certainly call for a new vote, and they would probably get that vote. So then there would be a long, drawn-out fight for Speaker. Who that could be is hard to say, impossible to predict probably. But that could be another one, and that would also show a lot of Republican dysfunction as you get closer and closer to the elections. So I think that few people really want to oust the Speaker per se, but they want to use the leverage they have on the Speaker, who hasn't shown a lot of courage, frankly, on much of anything, to move forward.
And that was far removed from his position before he became Speaker. But President Zelensky in the United States, when he was there, paid quite a few visits to different places, including New York. What's your summation of the impression he left with the American people?
I think generally, as a person and as a leader, the impression is positive. Did he persuade the country to step forward with more aid? He was seeking at least $24 billion more. He went home without that. And that's not going to happen until there's some type of legislative support for that. So I think there's a lot of admiration for him. I think that people are getting a little weary of the war. Would like to see it end sooner than later. I think Putin is playing on that, and it's going to make it very, very difficult for Zelensky. But I think he's consistently shown courage. It's hard to be critical, I suppose the one area that someone might be critical on is inflexibility, but on the other hand, he's defending his country. And what does flexibility or inflexibility mean in those cases? I think he needs to be admired for all that he has. He's shown a lot of courage. Not always been able to hold his temper, but I can't imagine many people that could under the situation.
Is the United States in a position to continue to give long-term aid to Ukraine? Or are we going to have a Vietnam proxy war with Russia on our hands?
Well, I think the reality is it is a proxy war now. We've supplied at least 60% of the aid that Ukraine is receiving worldwide. So clearly, without the United States aid, Ukraine would find it very, very difficult to move forward. So I think we essentially, whether we admit it or not, whether we like it or not, we are in a proxy war, and we have to determine what's at stake worth it. I think that to me one of the key points is that if Ukraine were to fall, say capitulate completely, does that encourage Putin, particularly then, to go after others? It probably does. That's the fear. That's the track record, and so the line in the sand, which Putin declared that Ukraine would be the line in the sand for Russia. I think the line in the sand, Ukraine has become the line in the sand for the United States and Europe as well.
The threat that Russia will, if it wins the war against Ukraine, has expansionist agendas. Is that a realistic fear? Do you think Russia will actually go after other nations as well and try and absorb them, former USSR countries?
I think it is a realistic fear, and the reason I say that is that Putin has always said it was a big mistake to cede the territories of the Soviet Union. So in one way or another, I think it is a real threat. He's shown that in Georgia. He's nibbled at Georgia. He's nibbled at Moldavia. He's been involved in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war. So you can't simply say that it's Ukraine and Ukraine only. And even if it is Ukraine and Ukraine only, at what price is that for the West, particularly, to have a friendly nation, or just any nation, frankly, be invaded by another nation and stand by and watch that happen? So, of course, history has shown that we've done that many times, but in the case Ukraine becomes very critical. So, yes, I think it's a valid concern. How much he would do that, I don't know, but the track record is showing that he's doing it in places like Georgia, Moldavia, Armenia, and so forth.
Well, we do pray for a speedy end to this entire tragic affair, and we do thank you for your contribution and insight this morning, Mr. Stephen Hayes, who joined us from Washington, D.C. in the United States.
Thank you. An honor as always. Thank you. Good to see you.
After the break, UN inquiry into the war determines that Russia tortured some Ukrainian victims to death. Please stay with us. Welcome back. You are in the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Members of a UN-mandated investigative body declared that their latest findings from the field indicate that Russian occupiers tortured Ukrainians so brutally that some of the victims died and forced families to listen as they sexually assaulted women next door. Chair of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, Eric Mouse, called the alleged use of torture widespread and systematic. Russia, of course, denies committing the atrocities or targeting civilians in Ukraine. According to him, Moscow was given an opportunity to respond to the allegations at the council hearing, but no Russian representative attended. In previous meetings, the Commission has ruled that violations committed by Russian forces in Ukraine, including the use of torture, may constitute crimes against humanity. You think?
The Commission has also focused its investigations on violence against personal integrity in regions which fell under Russian occupation for prolonged periods, namely in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. It has collected further evidence indicating that the use of torture by Russian armed forces in areas under their control has been widespread and systematic. The principal targets of torture were persons accused of being informants of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Commission has found that torture mostly took place in various detention centers controlled by Russian authorities. Similar methods of torture were used across different facilities during interrogation sessions, mainly aimed at extracting information from the victims. This led to severe pain and suffering. A victim who suffered torture through electric shock stated, "Every time I answered that I didn't know or didn't remember something, they gave me electric shocks. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like an eternity." In some cases, torture was inflicted with such brutality that it caused the death of the victims. Further, the Commission has found that in the Kherson region, Russian soldiers raped and committed sexual violence against women of ages ranging from 19 to 83 years, often together with threats of commission or other violations. Frequently, family members were kept in an adjacent room, thereby forced to hear the violations taking place.
The question of numbers to emphasize in response to your question is about the widespread, the regional widespread, rather than the numerical magnitude of the cases that we have investigated. It is a fairly large number, and it comes from very different regions across the country, close and far from the lines of battle.
A local entrepreneur in Odessa says civilian factories and workshops were destroyed on Monday as a result of the Russian airstrike in the southern Ukrainian city. Ukraine's military says the grain storage facilities that were destroyed were hit by 2 supersonic missiles. Joining us now on the show is retired U.S. Army Captain and National Defense and Military Strategist, Captain Bish Johnson. Captain Johnson is in our Abuja studios. Thank you for making out the time to be with us this morning.
Good morning, Olamide, and thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Our last story had to do with factories, facilities that were hit by supersonic missiles. At this stage of the war, could I begin by asking you, what is your biggest concern as it continues to drag out?
Well, for me, my biggest concern continues to be the same thing. Loss of innocent lives, disruption in global, food supply, the same very concerns that we have had right from the beginning of this war and up to this time. So the concern still remains, the concern still remains the same. Innocent lives paying for this unwarranted war, both within Ukraine and those who are also being impacted as a result of shortages in food supply around the globe.
There was an incident in a Ukrainian location where it was blamed on the Russians, an attack that resulted in over a dozen people that died. A subsequent investigation by an American organization found that, and it's yet to be proven, but found that it was the Ukrainians that accidentally struck their own people in this manner. How common is it for there to be cases such as these, or what they also term as friendly fire in warfare?
Well, Olumide, war is a terrible thing. There is usually no winners in war, because in war situation, this kind of mistakes are bound to happen. This is not the first time there has been this kind of incident. This kind of incident has happened in previous wars where, soldiers inadvertently, strike their own, strike their own people. So it's not new, because that's what happens in a war situation, and that's why most people have always advocated that war should always be the last resort in trying to settle any disagreement, because you never know where and what is going to happen when you do get into a war, a conflict situation like the one we are in right now. I'm sure that if the Russians had known from day one that this war is going to drag out this long, I don't think they would have ventured into it, because whether you like it or not, at the end of the day, Russia will never be the same as it was when this war initially began.
We also reported today the demise of the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, allegedly, according to the Ukrainians, Admiral Viktor Sokolov, at the instance of an attack on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. Subsequently, the Ukrainians say that they actually targeted a meeting of these senior Russian military officials. Is this the way to go for Ukraine, or is everyone fair game? Or is this poking the bear that will cause for terrible Russian repercussions?
Well, the commander is an enemy combatant, and if the Ukrainians take out that commander, I think it's a fair game. The Ukrainians have been very effective using this type of strategy, killing top Russian military commanders. This is not the first time. Initially, when the war began, if you recall, they had been very, very effective and precise in taking out top Russian generals. And so the only difference here is that in this instance, this commander happens to be an admiral, and was hit, far away behind the front lines. If this information is correct, this admiral will be the first admiral to have been killed in conflict since the end of Second World War. And so that is a huge, it's a huge deal for the Ukrainians.
It's a big deal for the Russians as well. Yeah, please go on.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is also a big deal for the Russians, because what this has done is that the Ukrainians have shown that they have the capacity to go far behind the front lines and target Russian commanders. And where this incident took place has been a very strategic location in terms of Russia being able to replenish and resource its forces both in the south and the east, in the Donbas region of Ukraine. And so that's significant.
Shouldn't there be fears or consideration? So if Russia now also begins, do you think Russia has failed in targeting senior Ukrainian officials militarily? Because as you just pointed out, the Ukrainians have been more successful in doing so. Have the Russians, well, we can only guess what their strategy is, but is it because they've not actually done that hasn't happened? Because if that does happen, that they begin to take out each other and take out possibly also civilian government officials, then we have a worsening situation on our hands.
Well, I'll look at it like this. Is it better to kill innocent civilians than to go after military commanders? Military commanders signed up for the job they are engaged in, so they are a fair target. Now, the fact that the Russians have not been as effective as the Ukrainians in taking out Ukrainian commanders, it does not mean that they have not been targeting them. They just haven't been that effective in doing so. Because the Ukrainians and the Russians are probably not using the same strategy. You know, I remember when I believe it was last year or early this year when I was on this program, and I did touch on the point of how the Russians deploy their forces as to compare to what happens with the US military, where you have non-commissioned officers having the ability to make decisions on the spot. Which is not the case with the Russians. The Russians, they don't have that kind of structure where these mid-level non-commissioned officers can make a decision on the spot. The commanders have to go to the front to be able to make those decisions. And by so doing, they put themselves at a very high risk of being targeted. The Ukrainians may be doing something different from that. And that probably is the reason why the Russians have not been able to get their commanders. It's not that the commanders is not in their purview or their target list.
In warfare, the introduction of tanks and infantry warfare was a game changer in the history of war. These Abrams tanks that have been deployed to Ukraine from the United States, for which our guest earlier said they might make an incremental impact, but not a significant one. Are you in agreement?
Absolutely. Whatever assets you get, you know, when in a war situation like this, particularly for Ukraine. Ukraine is a much smaller military when compared to the Russians. So whatever assets you get, of course, we add to your capacity. Particularly, you're talking about the best tank in the world, the Abrams tank. So, of course, it's going to add to the capability and the capacity of the Ukrainians to be able to continue to prosecute this war. Now, whether it's going to lead to decisive victory, that remains to be seen. I don't think it will. Because what you're talking about 30, 31 Abrams tanks, which is like just a tank battalion, is not sufficient enough for them to spread it across all of their fronts. But what they can use is that they can use it in targeted, you know, and strategic operations where there's need for them to break through Russian defenses. Yeah, sure, it will make an impact, but that impact is not going to be that significant as to alter the course of this war.
And the plot continues to thicken, and we thank you for your insight this morning. Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist, who joined us from Abuja.
Thank you, Olamide.
When we return, Russia summons Bulgarian ambassador over expulsion of Russian priest. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. No sooner did Russia begin a fuel export ban, did they begin to relax it. Joining us on the program to give us more information on this is Laddie Williams, Channels Television business correspondent. Laddie,
good morning.
So, good morning. So, they should make up their minds.
I know, right?
What exactly is the reason for this relaxation of the fuel export ban?
Yeah, so, we did get that screaming headline, last week that Russia, they actually, put a ban on export of diesel.
Yes.
It was quite big. The market, it sent shockwaves into the market because at the end of the day, when there's a ban of that kind, definitely it's going to impact prices. We saw the same thing happen with rice. When India banned the export of rice, we saw the price of rice, rise globally. So the same thing, markets were already expecting that with this export ban, for diesel from a country like Russia, definitely prices were going to go up. So we did see, in the oil market, we've seen prices have been elevated for the past 3 weeks.
Okay.
So now, that definitely, analysts were already saying this was going to impact Europe, that's for sure, because that would definitely take, diesel prices up, and Europe relies heavily, on diesel from their trucks, for movement of raw materials. They rely on, even some countries there rely on diesel for heating, So at the end of it, it's expected that it's going to hit Europe hard. So now, this relaxation, we've seen, that has started making the prices ease at this point, which, helps in the global market, because at the end of the day, if you're having to, energy prices is what's feeding into the inflation story right now. That's why we're seeing, central bankers globally, scampering around trying to bring down inflation. So this is a good move, but there's still, the ban still stays on other, gasolines.
Okay.
But for diesel, the ones that are high in sulfur, that comes out of Russia, they've released that for now. They've relaxed it. So it remains to be seen what happens next. But this is a good move, and it's going to definitely calm nerves in the markets.
Oil prices are dipping in early trade. What's driving that sentiment?
Yeah, so for the past 3 weeks, we've seen oil prices rising. It was the supply story that was driving prices up. We saw restrictions and cut in supply from countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia. So that has pushed prices. I remember a few months ago, oil was already trying to get into the $60 range. It was around about $70, that's Brent. But now, fast forward to today, we're seeing it did top at $95.
Okay.
Big move, from nowhere, and all because of, Saudi Arabia and Russia agreed to cut production. So now, that has, impacted prices, taking it up, But now we're seeing demand issues. Because yes, last week it was all about central bankers. And even though most central bankers, the major central bankers held rates, forward guidance was what's moving markets now. They did, the US Fed did say that if inflation, stays high, they will definitely keep rates higher for longer, even though it was a hold. Normally a hold is presumed dovish, but but now analysts tag this one a hawkish hold. So meaning that going forward, if inflation becomes a problem again or still stays above, their target, then they will keep interest rates.
That's global inflation or in the United States?
In the United States.
Okay,
and definitely, how the United States, whatever happens there impacts
the rest of the world.
The rest of the world, because we all rely on the almighty dollar. So, so at the end of the day, we're seeing, central bankers
change that
saying
to the mighty dollar.
I know, right? So at the end of the day,
who came up with that one?
So at the end of the day, now demand for oil, that one depends on economic growth, and once rates stay higher, that will impact economic growth, which will in turn impact demand for oil. So that's where we're seeing prices, start. So it's now from supply concerns, we're now with demand concerns.
Now for the global markets, how are they looking?
Yeah, for global markets, they're starting off red this morning in Europe. See the U.S. stock futures are also in the red. And it's still, with the rate story, with the central bankers. Everyone is expecting that if they keep rates high, if the forward guidance is still saying, okay, we're going to keep rates higher for longer, then at the end of the day, that's going to impact risk assets. So we're seeing a lot of pullback. Right now, we're seeing the U.S. dollar, that it hit a new high today, about 10-month high, about 105 points. That's the DXY. It did rise about 0.2%, this morning. So at the end of the day, we want to see because when we saw the U.S. dollar hit a high last year in 2022, it was because of what the U.S. Fed was doing with rates. So now, forward guidance is showing that rates are going to stay higher, so we're seeing the U.S. dollar rallying on that, and definitely investors are going to be like, okay, it's time to get assets off the table. That is risk-off sentiment, so that's what we're seeing now because the U.S. dollar is rallying, so we're seeing the market start off in the red. We're also seeing in the crypto market, that's impacting Bitcoin to starting off in the red this morning. So it remains to be seen what happens, but yeah, it's all about what happens with rates going forward.
And as that is happening, the United States is stepping up sanctions against some Russian and Chinese companies.
Right.
So the plot continues to thicken.
Exactly. Not easy being an investor at this time.
Yeah, not easy.
Right.
Thanks, Laddie.
Thank you.
Laddie Williams, Channel Television business correspondent. Germany has made plans to halve the federal aid it allocates for states to cover expenses of receiving and integrating refugees next year as part of budget tightening amid soaring inflation. More than 1 million people found refuge in Germany after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, and supporting them has taken a toll on the country's cities and municipalities. The country's 16 states have been demanding more federal funds to cover refugees' expenses next year. And finally, Russia's foreign ministry has summoned Bulgaria's ambassador, Atanas Krastin, over Sofia's expulsion of a Russian Orthodox cleric last week. Bulgaria has expelled 1 Russian and 2 Belarusian clerics for carrying out what it describes as activities directed against the country's national security and interests. Bulgaria is a member of NATO and the European Union. Historically, warm relations with Russia have come under strain in recent years, especially since Moscow sent troops into Ukraine. And that's where we call it a day for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.